Good afternoon, Mr. Robinson. Thank you very much for joining this interview. And first of all, I have to send you all the greetings and regards from my students who were having your Why Nations fail since 2012 on my lectures. So when you got your Nobel Prize, they took it as a compliment to themselves. So for knowing that and enjoying it, so I had to deliver their compliments and regards at first.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so my first question will be, of course, concentrated on institutions. And I thought that there was in this newspaper, rather, we were mentioning, there was a title saying, had it not been for such strong and durable American institutions, the US would have already been a dictatorship. So that is my first question. How far America is from dictatorships, and can institutions save America?
Well, I don't think it's a dictatorship. I think, President Trump was elected by a majority of people in the United States. So that would be a pretty unusual dictatorship, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, but it starts like that. So we know that very well. We elected our president 12 years ago on elections, and he has some fake elections even up to today. But we are in a dictatorship. So that was our analogy.
I see. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I don't think that's the way I think about it, honestly. I mean, the way I think about it is, I think you have to see President Trump as a kind of symptom of the problems in this country, of the polarization in this country, of the sort of rejection of, a lot of the ideology of sort of conventional politics in the United States, I think if you look at his political coalition, what sort of unites them is a rejection of the kind of liberal democratic political project in some sense. And so of course that comes in the context of, many other challenges, economic challenges, the fact that real wages of people who don't have a college education, which is the majority of population in the United States, are actually lower now than they were 50 years ago. So there's been all this economic growth, but it's been enormously unequally distributed. So I think there's a lot of problems, and this is happening with very little trust in institutions. So there's been a decline in trust in institutions in every dimension, in Congress, in this in the judicial system, and so of course the response to these problems is a kind of uninstitutional response because there's no trust in institutions. So that gives a lot of freedom for someone like Mr. Trump, who doesn't really believe in institutions, to sort of come to power and do his thing. And then, in some sense, like his political edge is that he actually understood there were all these grievances in society. Hillary Clinton didn't understand. Joe Biden didn't understand. Like the Democratic Party and traditional politicians, I think, were completely out of touch. So I think, of course, Mr. Trump doesn't. He doesn't care about institutions, and and he has a very kind of erratic way of behaving. But I honestly think, like, I don't think the way you thought about it, the way you've articulated that question, that's not the way I think about it. So maybe I'm more optimistic. I have a more optimistic take. I don't think the United States could go on, the way it was going on. Something had to change. It's a massive wake-up call. Now, whether the system kind of rebalances like it did in the 1930s, and whether it rebalances, and people find common ground and they find new ways of talking about these issues and stuff.
Yeah.
Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. We don't really see that at the moment. So it's a moment of great kind of fluidity where one could go in very different directions. But I don't really. I think it's very unclear, like what is going to emerge from this, honestly. So I don't see the United States as like teetering on dictatorship at the moment.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. My second question would be, That's something that remained unclear to me and to my students. Well, it was actually my experience, academic experience when visited American colleges and universities. So one impressions I always got there is unconditional trust and support for everything I was doing. I had a macroeconomic model. Being with the video game and some details, I was urging people from the university to see the model, and everyone said, "Did you protect your model?" So it is actually something quite I didn't expect. I wanted them to see it, not to make me. The other thing that happened at the MIT after the lecture, where I met Professor Samuelson and Simon Johnson was also there. So many people, respectable people were there. Not mentioning them now. Well, after the lecture, I thought it would be wonderful to ask Professor Samuelson to see the model and to give me any advices. I went to the secretary and I asked, is there any chance to have a meeting? And she just opened the book and she said, are you available at 4 tomorrow? And when I said yes, she rang the phone and she said, Paul, you have a meeting tomorrow at 4. So something unimaginable for Serbian circumstances to get such a meeting at such a short notice. Yeah. So my question is that the American culture, educational culture, or is that an institution?
Well, I mean, I think it's both, probably. I mean, in the sense
yes, I know that, but what is more?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, no, I think it's a combination. It's a combination both of a sort of culture and an institution yes. In the sense of like very meritocratic, that allows yes. kind of yes. people to be, appointed and, yes. And it's very open to outsiders and, yes. and people have this idea that you can always learn things from outsiders. There's a wonderful study by Roberto Perotti, who's an Italian economist at Bocconi University of Italian universities, where he shows that, Italian universities basically just hire their own students. The faculty of Italian universities are all people who just studied at that university. And so I think the US model is extremely different. It's very open like that. And so I think that is to do with the institutions in the sense that, for example, at the Harris School where I work at the University of Chicago, like we would never hire a PhD student working from, who graduated from the economics department or the business school, like not, just like, so that I think that is a rule. That's a rule, so that's an institution. And that's a rule that kind of facilitates this meritocracy and this kind of openness to outsiders. But I think it is also cultural, and it's a rule that, for example, you're talking about, like showing your work to other people. That's because yes. you're concerned about other people like stealing ideas or something.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. So and there's rules about that. There's rules about plagiarism and but there's also culture. Also, like yes. I mean, I think my work, our work, in social, as in social science, you try to keep things simple. Yeah, it's very easy to say something complicated. So it's harder to say something simple. So I think, so I think like a lot of our work tends to kind of de-emphasize cultural things. Yes. But I think that's probably, an example where the culture is important, that this does breed a culture of respect for other people and kind of, respect for what other people know and what other people understand. And this idea, and this idea of like sharing knowledge and, so I think that's both. It's probably difficult to create. It's probably difficult to create. Like why have they been able to create that so effectively in the United States? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what research on that. I think like, for example, even in England, England is pretty good, but like yes. if you look say at Cambridge University, the economics department at Cambridge University, they, in some sense, 100 years ago, they had Alfred Marshall, they had John Maynard Keynes, they had A.C. Pigou, they had the sort of towering figures in economics of that generation. But they hired all their own students, and Cambridge became a kind of intellectual backwater,
That's right.
It never really recovered from that, So even in Britain that can happen.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My other question is concentrated on the case of former Yugoslavia. So it is fundamentally, when you see the characteristics, that is on the first step, in the first glance, you could imagine that your theory of institutions do not work. For instance, that was a country of 7 republics and even more, 2 autonomous provinces, who started in various levels of development. So the ratio of the highest to the lowest was 3-1 in the beginning in 1945. Under the same institutions in a communist country, same economic and political institutions. In 1990, the difference between the highest and the lowest was 9-1. So it is simply, one could say, and that was what we discussed very much at on my lessons, is that why nations failed? Did they say something wrong? What's the problem with us? What we found out actually to be the solution of the problem, and this is where I would like your opinion, is that there was one thing that was missing in former Yugoslavia, and this is the hard budget constraint. So that was left out. So this Janos Kornai work, which meant that that country, we didn't have bankruptcy institution, and nothing could bankrupt unless the Communist Party would like it to bankrupt. So everything remained. You could be as unsuccessful as you wish, and you would remain, and your firm would remain. So there was no creative destruction through bankruptcy, nothing. And it simply ruined. It fell. So it was not the institutions, it was just the lack of one institution working properly. So this is what we...
Yes. But you're talking about the socialist period
under Tito. That's right.
Yeah. Yes. Under Tito.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I guess there were many different institutions. I mean, I'm not an expert on Yugoslavia, so I respect your assessment of what was the critical institutions. But I guess there were many other institutions about property rights, collective property rights. Although I mean, you had all these cooperatives and things in Yugoslavia, which is always given an example of interesting institutional innovation in the socialist period. No.
They are absolutely right. Yes, but you just have high growth in some parts of the country and zero growth in other parts on the same institutions. And
in the socialist period, or since
in the socialist period, yes.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I don't know that people have studied that. I don't know that people have studied that actually. This question of like differential. Economic growth within socialism. I think, socialism tends to be treated as this very homogeneous phenomenon. And we know that that's not true about, many countries I've worked in, for example, Colombia. We discuss in Colombia, like how there's very different parts of Colombia with very different economic performance, or Argentina or Mexico, so I think that's actually a fascinating topic, like trying to explain differential performance within. But I haven't really thought about that myself, and I have, that's that. So I think that's just a very interesting set of questions, but I'm not sure I know much about it. Yeah.
No, so thank you so much. Well, the other one is China, actually, as a society which would not fit in the institutions and the inclusive institutions in politics, especially, and having such growth. So the question is standard. Would it? How does it happen? that China grows so much without institutions. So
yeah, I mean, China has institutions,
yes, of course,
and I think, the big story about the transition to economic growth, which starts in the late 1970s, is exactly a transition to more inclusive economic institutions,
right.
But the puzzle from our perspective is how is this sustainable with extractive political institutions?
Right.
So I think there's two answers to that. I mean, there's the answer in Why Nations Fail, which probably if you asked me to give you one answer, I'd give you that answer. And the one sentence version of that answer is power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Meaning, I think if you look at world history, you find many examples of what we call extractive economic growth. The Soviet Union, from the middle of the 1920s, for the next 50 years being a great example of that. Obviously, there's lots of differences with China, but there's many other examples. In 1920, Argentina was probably one of the 10 richest countries in the world, because it was in the right place at the right time. It was sitting on all these natural resources, and it boomed. So I think there's many examples of that. But what we say is that that's just not. It's not sustainable. It's not that you can't power is always abused. With many consequences and negative ones for the economy. So if you ask me, I still think that's going to happen. I still think ultimately the Communist Party in China is more interested in holding power than it is in economic growth, and it doesn't need economic growth to hold power. Look at North Korea. In fact, North Korea is kind of much more a classical Why Nations Fail type story, where the regime sees promoting economic growth as detrimental to its power, so it doesn't do it. It knows how to do it. It knows exactly how to do it. It's sitting next to South Korea and China, but it doesn't allow it because it feels it's too threatening. So I think it's easy to imagine that that's going to happen in China, and then the whole thing will go into reverse. So that's the Why Nations Fail view. I think there's another view which I find fascinating, which I've been researching. I guess Professor Acemoglu and I talk a little bit about this in our book, The Narrow Corridor, which is to say, in social science, we've been very bad at conceptualizing the cultural differences of different kind of political and social equilibria. I think if you look at the history of China, if you look at Chinese philosophy or Chinese political philosophy, it's extremely different from Western political philosophy. Problem of governance. If you think about Confucius, Confucius's thought is mostly about the governance of the state and the organization of society, and it's an extremely different image from what you get in Western political thought, like say Aristotle. So I think one should take that seriously. That the Chinese just have a very different model of society and the relationship between the citizen and the state, and and the notion of good governance. And so many of the intuitions that we kind of emphasize in Why Nations Fail don't really apply in China, because the logic of the equilibrium is different. And so I think that's a very interesting thing to think through and discuss. But every time I say that, I think about the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution is a great example of power corrupts, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So even within China, you see this. So that's kind of why I would go back to. But I think reasonable, intelligent, kind of well-informed people can disagree about these things. And I also find myself nowadays, I spend a lot of time thinking about these questions of cultural differences and different cultural understandings and different cultural underpinnings of institutions. So I think there's a serious set of questions there. And, and the longer the Chinese experience of economic growth goes on, the more we question our understanding of the world.
Yes, but I think that you mentioned the key word, which is sustainability.
Yeah.
In their growth, it used to be 12% annually for a decade or more. It is at least 6% now, so it is declining. And the trouble is when you calculate how big the Chinese growth rate has to be in order to keep the same level of development to America, not to reach them, but just to keep on the same level, it is 6 to 7%. So if it goes beyond, they will start declining, and that's trouble then.
Yeah.
So
well, I get, yeah.
Then the exclusivity of their political institutions will be a great obstacle for further development. So at least it seems something like that now. Yeah, well, I think that we have another several minutes for some questions. We have in Serbia at the time big student protests. That's almost a year. We have the, in 3 weeks that will be 1 year of the protest that students made because of the total failure of our institutions. So that's a sort of the story that is happening over here. And not only that institutions are on the first and foremost aim that they are making, they also make inclusive institutions. For instance, their inclusivity you could see even through the fact that when we had this Eastern feast and holidays, they had their blockades on the university, but many Christian students went home at the time. Universities remained full because our Muslim citizens and students from the southern part of Serbia came to replace them on the blockades. So this is that sort of inclusivity and maybe culture and something. So this is actually that makes your work that fundamental. So the institutions that were stayed over here as the most important thing to achieve in a country. And well, this is something that we are always mentioning your work about. And
okay.
After that, I don't know whether we have time for the question about the artificial intelligence and what will happen to institutions.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I mean,
okay.
my major concern about artificial intelligence is, like the leaving aside the sort of doomsday scenario of robots taking over the world. I don't see much evidence for that, honestly. Is that the problem with artificial intelligence is that, it's being developed by people who just don't think about the social consequences. If you thought about, like we were describing earlier, all these social problems in the United States, a lot of that is caused by the spread of computers, and the fact that computers basically replace many unskilled workers, and they've driven down their wages. And the same thing is going to happen with artificial intelligence. Like this obsession, for example, with driverless vehicles, is going to displace truck drivers, Uber drivers, taxi drivers. It's going to displace tens of thousands of unskilled workers, and no one cares about the social consequences of that. That's somehow the logic of the American model of capitalism. It's much less bad in Western Europe because there's social insurance, there's some concern with kind of helping people to adjust. So I would say, the first order effect in the United States of the spread of artificial intelligence is going to be to exacerbate all of the social problems we have at the moment, and that's a pretty terrifying prospect.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I agree completely. Well, I think that we've spent all the time that we had for our conversation, and I thank you very much for all these valuable answers I got from you.
No,
thank you so much.
My pleasure. I hope we can meet in person at some point. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will stay in touch via your agent for.
Of course. Yes. Okay. Of course. My pleasure. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.